Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Meta-Humanism podcast. There was a bit of a break last week, but I'm back now. So I'll give you an update of what I've been up to, and then today's episode will be relatively brief. So first, an update is that I traveled to Europe recently, to more specifically to Belgium and the Netherlands. Brussels as a focal point of our trip, but also I visited Ghent, Antwerp, and also in the Netherlands, Rotterdam, The Hague, and Amsterdam. So the purpose of the trip was to advocate for Ukraine and the initiative that I'm involved with currently as a president, called European Action for Ukraine. I will provide the link to our website. It's still a new initiative and we're developing, and this was our first working trip to meet with the local Ukrainian community in Belgium, both old diaspora from post-World War II organizations and the newly emerged organizations in the last few years. As well as to meet with representatives on the European level at the European Parliament. We had a few meetings we had a meeting with the European Mission to the EU, and as well as local meening Belgian officials and so on. The overall goal was to find out how we can better support Ukraine going forward, and how we can encourage more advocacy for Ukraine in Europe. So that was a very productive, very intense trip. Many meetings, very busy, but also many interesting impressions. I managed to also make some sightseeing visits or cultural investigations, so to speak, related to the arts and history of. For example, Erasmus of Rotterdam came from Rotterdam, right? So that was a historical connection. Various artists came from Brussels, Antwerp, the gang, and so all of that culture was certainly a nice addition, pleasure to add to the working trip. Okay, so that's why there was a little bit of a pause in the stream of episodes that I've been releasing. But I'm back now, and today I want to just add to my latest episode on epistemology. We discussed subject and object division and how it emerged, and the field of noetics, or intellect, the way intellect functions. And today I want to very specifically look at the movements of thought. So it'll be a brief investigation of a list of the movements of thought, basic movements of thought, and which is useful to understand, and then have some idea about to know how our mind works and how we think, and how we can and do use our minds, whether consciously or not. So let's go into it. There will be 13 basic movements of thought I will be discussing today, and obviously there are other possible ways to classify these things. These are fairly abstract ideas in some ways, but I would say that most lists would include the majority of what I will be discussing in some shape or form. So if you remember in the one of the previous episodes, I think it was the 6th episode about epistemology, I described typologies and what function they play in philosophy. And so this is just one typology of movements of thought. It's not a exhaustive or definitive one, but it is a useful heuristic. It's a useful device to keep in mind these distinctions we'll be discussing in a minute. So let's begin. First, the way to look at these 13 movements and classify them or group them is to split them into 3 separate groups based on a kind of cognitive, the way, the level of processing, I guess, or cognitive level. So there's basic cognitive level, pre-reflective movements of thought. So the things that we do with our mind before we actually start thinking about the content of our thoughts, or just kind of maybe not as active but more automatic. Processing of information from the outside and classifying that information maybe, and then so that's the first group, is the basic cognitive pre-reflective movements of thought. Second group will be reflective or active thinking, so reflective movements, which is more about processing, understanding, insight, making decisions. So it's a next level up, so to speak. You've received some information in, excuse me, and the next step is to process that information, organize it mentally, and use it in some way. Start using to make decisions and gain insight, learn. And then the third and final level is metacognitive, so creative level. So it's metacognitive, meaning thinking about thinking in a way. So that's what we're doing, what we're engaged in currently, really, is talking about thinking, and that's metacognitive. We're discussing how thinking happens. And so reframing, evaluating things, innovating, these are the kinds of functions that belong to this group of movements of thought. So the basic group, there are 4 movements I will be discussing. The reflective, the middle group, the second group has 5 movements. And the last one again has 4, so that's together is 13 movements, 4, 5, and 4. And again, this is not specifically designed to be symmetrical. It's just the way it makes sense to group them. So let's another way. So that's one way, and then these same movements of thought, 13 of them, which I would just be patient. I will start naming them in a second, but they can also be grouped or looked at from the point of view of how we process information and acquire and use the facts and knowledge, or facts and information, and turn them into knowledge. So in that sense, another way of classifying movements of thought is into more groupings, basically pairs, but not all of them are in pairs. First is a category would be input. So the input category, where you gain data, you gain new information. So there are 2 movements of thought in that. Second is retention, only 1 movement of thought, that's very specific function. Retention. Third category is representation. So that's again 2 movements of thought, and every subsequent category will be 2 movements of thought from now on. So it's a representation of the world, I guess, outside, representation of it in thought. Processing, excuse me, processing of the information that you've gained, and more active approach towards that information. Again, 2 movements of thought. Then evaluation is another category related to processing, kind of a central category, but processing is one, evaluating is another one. And then the last 2 are metacognition. So you see some similarities. Metacognition, going beyond the thinking itself, and then creativity and agency is the last category. So there are 7 categories in this classification: input, retention, just to reiterate, representation, processing, evaluation, metacognition, and creativity and agency, the last one. So okay, so now let's go, and I will refer to these 2 different ways of breaking down or classifying the movement of thought as we go along. So let's start with the first movement of thought, is perception. So that's what the first in terms of input, that's the first one, and also in terms of the basic cognitive pre-reflective grouping, it's the first thing to do. We use our senses to perceive something, some new information, to perceive the world. We see, we taste, we hear, we touch, we smell, or we intuit in some way, right? So that's sixth sense sometimes. So roughly, we perceive things that way. And I think just gathering raw data basically is what that is all about. Second movement of thought is attention. So perceive, and then attention is selecting. So it's selective perception. So you can perceive almost anything, but we often unconsciously often choose what we perceive. So we can't perceive at all because there's so much stimuli in the world, so much noise, so to speak. And in information theory, there is that term, signal and a noise. So our attention is what we use, sometimes just automatically, more automatically and subconsciously, and other times very, very consciously and deliberately. We select what we perceive and what we see, what we hear, and we filter all that stream of noise and information and pick out that which is more, important for us or more relevant. So that's the second movement of thought. And then the third one, and now we're moving from input into retention, but it's still the basic category of cognitive pre-reflective thought, and that's memory. That's the third movement. So you recall previous experiences or memories of previous anything that's happened before that is no longer happening, that stayed with you, that you retained some information about it in your mind, that memory, and you can access it. There's also traumatic memories, which you might not want to remember, but they stay with you and influence your behavior. So that's also an important factor to consider. So that's the third movement of thought. So the last, the fourth movement of thought in the first basic category of the three is imagination. In terms of the processing of data, it's in the category of representation, because in imagination, even in the word itself, image, right? You have in your mind, you create an image of something you perceived earlier, or you just imagine something you've never seen before, or just something completely new, and that's a whole another level. But typically, it's something you've seen before, or a combination of things you've seen before combined in a new way. It may happen, but it's a basic function of imagination is to present images in your mind of things you've seen or perceived before, or you perceive now. And just to present them, represent that content of the outside world within our own mind. So that's why it's called a representation. So presentation is when you actually come to see come to perceive something, an object or whatever it is outside in the world. That's kind of original presentation, yes. And representation is the image you have in your mind of that object or whatever it is we're talking about, discussing. Or something more abstract than an object. Okay, so those are the four basic movements of thought, based on cognitive, focused on cognition, and before you start reflecting on that information you've gained. It's more automatic, more basic, more wouldn't say passive, not necessarily passive, but more so than what we will discuss next. So that was input and retention, and then starting with the representation. Now we're moving into the second category, which is more reflective and thought and active kind of thinking. Processing, understanding, gaining insight, learning, and decision making. And the next movement of thought is abstraction. We're still staying in the realm of representation as far as information processing goes. So imagination and abstraction are kind of belong together in that category of representation. So it's a kind of representation is about creating models or mental images and generalizing. Yeah, so that's the abstraction part, is generalizing from the concrete, let's say, objects you see. You see one cat, you see two cats, you see yet another cat, and then you generalize based on that. You abstract an idea of a cat out of that, for example, right? So that's the first movement of thought in that category. Next two movements in the following category will be analysis and synthesis. In some ways they're opposite in some ways, but let's discuss more carefully, because these are important. And they are belong in a category of processing information. Breaking down and combining is the analysis part. So when you have something and you want to, let's say, you have an apple and you want to study it and understand what it's made of, and what different parts it has. Or your own body, you want to understand what every part does and how it's important. You analyze. Your body is one, you can say, one whole thing, right? You move it along, but it has parts. It has one arm, left arm, right arm, left leg, right leg, a torso, right? And torso can be broken down into different parts as well, a rib cage, let's say, a belly, whatever, back. But so you analyze something into parts, right? You break it down and understand the parts. And then the opposite process, or taking the parts and putting them together and then synthesizing, that's the opposite process of combining, forming wholes, seeing maybe any disparate or isolated perceptions or information pieces that you've gained. You can put them together into something greater, bigger whole in your mind, and synthesize it into something new or a new concept, let's say, and that's possible. So these are two very important, obviously, analytic approach for philosophy, for thinking. Now we're getting to the meat of things, analyzing things and synthesizing things, the opposite, two opposite and equally important processes. You can't just analyze, break everything down into smaller parts and leave it there, because then and this does become a problem sometimes when people don't approach it with care on a more abstract level. So you need to synthesize. Then that's one of the criticisms, for example, of postmodernism and deconstruction, is that it's all well and fine to put into question the structures of imperialism, colonialism, modernism, humanism. It's fine to analyze it, deconstruct them into parts, and show how they're problematic, that they're not natural, that they're socially constructed, that historically they've been built on shaky foundations or inequalities that are not justifiable, and so on. That's fine, but then once you deconstruct, the next step you must take, is to reconstruct, or engage in a constructive effort, to synthetic effort, to produce or offer something new, a new synthesis that corrects for the errors or shortcomings of the old one. If you don't offer that, then that's where the sense of being lost among it all. You deconstruct everything, you fragment everything, you take everything apart into its smallest parts, and then you deconstruct the grand narratives, as the postmodernists call them, and then you're left with nothing, with just pieces, fragments, and no understanding of what it all means anymore. And that's a very profound sense of vertigo, meaninglessness. Often it can produce that kind of a feeling and disorientation in the world. What does the world mean? All the worldview is constructed by people and has always been through history to explain, whether it's religious or philosophical or some other worldview, every single one ever in existence, traditional, new, modern, whatever, indigenous, all of those worldviews, religious views, mythological views, philosophical views, as many as there are of them, within each culture produced their own, each civilization produced many. So it had a deep meaning and a deep function and a deep necessity for humanity to explain and find meaning in life. And that's why there's religion, philosophy, art as well are interrelated in many ways in that sense. Existential pursuit or seeking of existential meaning of life within life. And obviously the answer to that process of seeking will differ, whether you take a specific religious outlook or specific philosophical outlook or artistic approach. The answers differ, but then we are enriched as we consider these different answers to some of the same questions. So that was, again, analysis and synthesis. And now I want to add something, and we're getting into the meat of things again, as I said. So it's getting more complicated now. The basic level was simple, but the reflective, the active thinking is becoming more complex. So synthesis with the next movement of thought, which is judgment, and we'll discuss that in a second. They both are form a part of a, you could say, like a process or a higher level or a higher order process of thinking, which is called concretization. So it's kind of opposite to abstraction, but it's not included really as a separate movement of thought because it's a compound thing. As I just said, it involves both synthesis as a movement and judgment at the same time. So it's a complex process, concretization. So abstraction, generalizing, it seems to be it's more straightforward in that sense. It seems to function more directly. You just generalize from concrete things that you encounter. But the process of concretization, so going from a more general abstract level to a more concrete level, that movement of thought is more complex, and it's really made up of two different movements, which is synthesis and judgment. And so let's look at that more carefully. And we're with this movement of judgment, we're now in the sphere of a category of evaluation in terms of information processing. It's not just processing; it's now evaluation, right? Judgment, using your judgment, and but we are still in the reflective, the second middle category of the three basic ones. So. Now evaluation. So now let's look more specifically in more detail at this what concretization means. So there are two cognitive operations: judgment and synthesis. Judgment is basically, another way of saying is discrimination, evaluation, determination. Moral judgments or aesthetic judgments. Judgments of beauty. Or ethical judgments, right? Those are two major categories to think about. And then synthesis is more like integration, as I just described, unification, combination of things. So these are not separate steps if you talk about the process of concretization, but they're dynamically fused in that process, and to help thought become more concrete, specific, individualized, individuated, and contextualized. So judgment, so let's take it one step at a time. Judgment is basically an act of determining what something is, whether it's true, good, valid, or whatever else. What are its characteristics? And it generally involves differentiating and discernment. So you see what the differences are. Let's say you have two paintings, like what the differences are. Why does one strike you more as more beautiful, let's say, or more evocative than the other, let's say? Or why do you think that this combination of colors is better than that combination of colors? You have to look into it, you have to use analysis, break it down, and then use synthesis as well. So use judgment, compare, differentiate things, discern, and so on. And then synthesis, which I already hinted, then you also have to do that. So once you differentiate, you combine these different elements, impressions, your individual impressions, data, concepts, into some coherent story or whole or understanding, right? So it's constructive. It produces meaning by finding relations and associations. That's synthesis. So concretization basically combines the judgment, the differentiation, discernment, and synthesis. You could also even say that it also maybe includes some of the analysis as well in the process of, as you judge, you use some analytical thinking as well. So you could also include that. So in philosophy, so it's specific. Concretization kind of makes abstract and general ideas you might have very specific, concrete, contextualized, embodied, and that's very important also. So it's prevents you from unfortunately very often with philosophy it can get so abstract and so divorced from anything that tangible or real that people may get lost in the abstraction and get wrong ideas and be led astray away from the truth and into just these abstract speculations which have no relation to reality. To summarize that discussion of concretization, when somebody says judgment and synthesis are combined in concretization, what is meant is that concretization is not merely applying some pre-existing concept, which is judgment, or and neither is it just merging some pre-existing impressions, which is synthesis, right? It's interplay of the two. It's active interplay. You discern and select, which is judgment, and then you integrate and unify, which is synthesis. And then out of that, you flesh out something real, situated, and meaningful, and that's concretization. So that's its kind of higher order thinking. This is not a linear process, it's more of a dialectical movement. So it doesn't like go from cause and effect and one to one to one. It's a dialectical, dynamic movement. It goes back and forth, interplay of different parts. And synthesis enriches judgment by expanding or contextualizing it. Judgment refines synthesis by limiting or clarifying it, by keeping discernment clear and incisive. Together they generate a more concrete, embodied, and individuated understanding, right? So that's I think it's very important. Just to use some examples, and I have used some examples that I was discussing, but let's say moral judgment in a concrete situation. Let's say there is an abstract principle, lying is wrong or stealing is wrong. On the whole, the good principle to apply. Sure, you shouldn't lie, you shouldn't steal if you can avoid it. But in concrete case, for example, you can use a very famous example is Victor Hugo's Les Miserables, his novel about France in 19th century. And his example was the Jean Valjean stole bread to feed the hungry. Or a concrete case that the person lies to protect someone else from violence, and so because he knows if he tells the truth that the person some person he knows may suffer violence. So judgment is required here. Is it still wrong to lie or to steal in these situations, right? So you need to apply that moral judgment. Sure, there's an abstract principle a rule you want to follow in generally speaking, but then in a concrete contextualized situation, you make a judgment call. You can't just pretend that abstract rule always applies and always goes one way and doesn't matter what the context is. That's not the way life works. But some people do that. Some people really stick to the rules so hard that they don't understand the context, that they're not even interested in the context. And that's where harm comes from very often, that people refuse to contextualize and concretize and be situated in the abstractions they believe in. So the result of the above process of synthesis and judgment, you consider the moral law, the emotional context, the historical conditions that led up to that situation, and you don't just apply the rule blindly, but you concretely apply ethical insight, right? So that's the meaning of morality, not just blind following the rules. That's one example. Another example, which I also hinted at, is art critique, the judgment in terms of beauty or aesthetics. You judge a painting, let's say, you can judge it purely on aesthetic criteria like style, technique, symbolism, and make a judgment and say that, okay, maybe that particular painting is executed better, or it symbolizes something better. Style is more mature or more developed, or better style. Technique is better executed. But then you also synthesize additionally and consider what does the painting evoke, what is its historical context, what was the artist's vision or intention. And these additional dimensions contribute also to understanding it may not be a perfect, technically speaking, painting, or stylistically speaking, or compositionally, let's say, or even symbolically. There may be some flaws, but it may still be a great work of art because of these other aspects of historical, artistic aspects and evocative aspects. It still may be a great masterpiece of art, even though not technically perfect. So that's again, this is what, as with morality, art and beauty is not about perfection or some technical perfection. If that were true, almost anybody could be a great artist. But art is not about perfection of technique. That's more like being a craftsman, is to perfect your technique and just repeat it every time in the same way. Art is more ineffable than that. It's harder to capture. It requires something additional, intuition, creativity, which is not accessible to each of us in the same way, and it requires very specific kind of talent. Not that it's not possible to develop that talent, but it's not accessible equally to everyone. Unfortunately, that's just the nature of it. So the final response then is not judgment, oh, it's good or bad, it's beautiful or ugly, this kind of binary way of thinking, whether it's this or that, it's either black or white. It's not pure, so it's not pure judgment, it's not pure synthesis, saying, oh, it evokes this. And so there's only one answer. No, because as we know, our works of art often receive various responses from various people, and that's the beauty of it, of the process of the art. Evokes different things from different people because of the way it encompasses many meanings at the same time often. So it's kind of this aesthetic judgment, by combining pure judgment with pure synthesis, but combining the two processes, two movements of thought, it helps produce more concretized appreciation of the holistically of the work of art, and in its full meaning and particularity of its fullness, really. So those are just two very important examples of this, how two different movements of thought, which I discussed, which was synthesis and judgment, they combine in something higher order concretization, which is not really a movement in its own because it's comprised of two separate ones, but it's important process to understand as well. So moving forward, so we went through, just to recap quickly right now, we went through basic level of perception, attention, memory, and imagination so far, and then went into the second level of reflective thinking, and we moved into abstraction, analysis, synthesis, and judgment so far. Okay. So we're still remaining in that category, but now we're moving, we're continuing also in the category of evaluation in terms of how we process information. We've gone through input, retention, representation, processing, and now we're in the category of evaluation, which includes judgment, which I already mentioned, and next one is reasoning. So to describe this category of evaluation most generally, it's basically assessing the truth or forming arguments. That's what judgment and reasoning is about, comparing and differentiating. So judgment we already discussed kind of as part of concretization along with synthesis, and then so aesthetic, ethical, or political judgment are prime examples of that kind of use of thought. And then next is reasoning. It can be split. There are three major kinds of reasonings. Or types of reasoning, and that's deduction, induction, and abduction. So what is induction? And we sort of kind of some parallels to what we discussed about analysis and synthesis, you will notice. Deduction is basically reasoning from the general to the specific. Induction is the opposite, is the reasoning from the specific to more general. And then abduction, it's reasoning or inference through trying to get to the best explanation. So that's abduction, just the technical term, philosophical term for it. Inference to the best explanation of something, like diagnosing, educated guessing, things like that, are examples of that. Inference to the best possible explanation you can achieve. So those are clearly very important, obviously, for argumentations, constructing your arguments when you want to make your case about something in law or in debate with somebody, in politics, in any kind of human interaction, sphere of human interaction, where different types of knowledge may interact, and you have points of view interact, opinions, facts. You have to argue, you have to present yourself, your argument well. So that's the art of rhetorics and oratory and logic, and we kind of discussed this in previous episodes. That's why it was so important to study poetry, rhetorics connected to poetry, and logic, dialectics related to logic and how you construct your arguments, and then how to use language, right? So that's this shows you how it's all interconnected. So these movements of thought, and the parallel with analysis and synthesis is deduction is going from general to specific, induction from specific to general, just like analysis was taking things apart, and synthesis putting them back, combining them back together. So the parallels. And this is also relates to science, because science generally uses both deduction and induction, and also abduction in some ways, but inductive method of science is probably the dominant one, is by looking at specific concrete things that we can grasp and perceive by experience, and then building more general theories and more generalizations, rules, theories, hypotheses based on those observations, more basic observations. That's in process of induction. Science and scientific revolution was in the 16th century, roughly. That was a very big emphasis on inductive thinking, whereas deductive thinking, from going from general to specific, was more of a philosophical, speculative approach. And is the scientific revolution was kind of more suspicious of that kind of thinking, that trying to first have some kind of general rule and then go down into the more specific explanations, because from scientific point of view, you have to observe the basic phenomenon first, and then you can generalize and create the larger, more abstract theory based on that data, right? So again, this is the problem that emerges when people who are in science forget that deduction is just as important. Abduction, in medicine, diagnostic medicine is important. Educated guessing when you have to make a decision is also a very important skill to have. Informed guess. So it's not just guessing like, well, let me just kind of like just stick a finger in the middle of this chaos and see where it lands, or it's trial and error. No, educated guessing is using information and using it in a reasoned way to achieve the best decision you are able to make in the situation of, let's say, uncertainty, where you cannot be fully certain about things, and which is life in general. So so that's where that's the evaluation part, right? So judgment we discussed. Now we discuss reasoning. We're still in the very meat of things. That's where most thinking happens. But now we're taking a step into the next level, the final level of the three. The one was basic pre-reflective, then the reflective active thinking, and the next one is metacognitive or creative level, and that's thinking about thinking. So it's like turning thought back on itself in a way. So and that's the same category in terms of processing information. It's metacognition. Going beyond thinking. So two movements of thought relevant to this category is basically reflection and intuition. There's two more, and the final category of creativity and agency we'll discuss. But right now, for metacognition level category, there's reflection and intuition. And so basically, it's reflection is thinking about on your thought processes, noticing things, being more careful and about what you think and how you think, and noticing your habits of thinking, and not being as automatic or unconscious about it, but being more precise, more conscious, more deliberate, and recognizing certain patterns, and maybe stopping yourself and checking your habits or certain tendencies which may mislead you otherwise. So that's reflection. And then intuition is we discussed in previous episodes again about the intuitive knowledge and the gnosis. So it's not something you can rationally maybe always explain or discursively describe, but it comes from it's still knowledge, and it's important aspect of knowledge. You do sometimes need a lot of discursive knowledge and arguments and considering all kinds of things before intuition can emerge. On some level in our minds, it can combine this information in some creative way, and intuitive insight intellectual insight can emerge out of that. And this process is the philosophers looked at it in great detail, and obviously we'll talk about it in many ways in future episodes, more specifically or more in more applied situations. But in a general way, to discuss it is that intuition is basically quick unconscious insight, right? So it may require prior conscious effort to gain knowledge, information, and so on, but then later on, this kind of unconscious processing and rapid processing of that data may cause certain intuitive insight, which is hard to explain or describe or set out in rational terms, strictly rational terms. So that's that. And two more additional movements of thought, and the final ones. The last category in terms of processing information is creativity and agency. And it's still within that third category of metacognitive creative level. So this creativity and agency, creativity and agency is also another way of describing it is will or volition, right? So those are the final and last movements of thought, and they're almost most difficult to explain, and they're most philosophical also, and many philosophers, there's philosophies of will, a perspective called voluntarism thing. The will is primary to everything, life itself. So there's like Nietzsche thought that way. Schopenhauer, his predecessor, also will was very important for him as a concept. It's been critiqued since, but it's still important to consider, and we will be considering that in the future for sure, because it does apply to human life. Will to create something, to create your own life, to be active in your life. To be, creativity and will both interplay, so you can see how they're important, but at the same time hard to grasp or capture, or very, very elusive. So it's innovating, choosing. You can understand how important that is. Obviously, especially in our today, with all the technologies that are enabling us to be creative. And it's important to understand what it means to be creative, what it is. How can you be creative? And anybody can be creative. I did mention that art, for example, it does require a certain kind of talent. But that doesn't mean that people cannot be artistic. To be a great artist is not for everyone. Not everyone can be that. But anyone can be creative. Anyone can create art. Anyone can be artistic. Anyone has agency within the limits of the constraints of their own particular circumstances and talents. Somebody who's more talented in other ways, somebody can be a great artist, another person can be a great sportsman, somebody can be a great politician, a great doctor, any great tailor, great, all the crafts are needed. Great, obviously, the arts, the crafts are kind of, now everything is mechanized, and I don't know, maybe we'll regain that beauty of the crafts, with things made with your own hands, handmade clothing, and it's still a thing, and a lot of people do that. It's culture, but obviously because of the industrial level of production, things have moved away from that model, but in some ways it's making a comeback now that we've reached the level where AI is entering the picture, and the creativity level is the most human thing about us that can be, really, and that's something machines will never be able really truly to mimic. That's my belief, at least. They can mimic it, but they can't really achieve the true creativity that human engages in. Mimicking something is not the same as creating that. And that's something to discuss in the future. Very deeply philosophical matter, and fascinating as well. But that's pretty much what I wanted. It came out to be actually a full-length episode. I thought it would be much quicker, but once you start talking about thinking, obviously things get complicated. So just to reiterate and to close, again, there were three groups of movements of thought. Basic one, the cognitive, pre-reflective functions. then the reflective and more active functions of thinking, and then the third level was metacognitive or creative level, right? And in terms of, so in the first category, there were perception, attention, memory, and imagination. So the basic functions. In the second level, on the reflective side, or active thinking, processing, there were abstraction, analysis, synthesis, judgment, and reasoning. Three types of reasoning: deductive, inductive, and abductive, but it's one movement of thought for the purposes of typology. And I will add that the higher order process based on synthesis and judgment was concretization, which is kind of almost opposite of abstraction, but it's not a separate movement of thought, not included as a separate movement because it's made up of two different ones. And then in the last level of metacognitive creative level, there were reflection, intuition, creativity, and will or volition, two different ways of saying the same thing. And again, to reiterate, in terms of the information processing, input level, that was the perception and attention. Retention, that was the memory. And representation category of it was imagination and abstraction. Processing category was analysis, synthesis. Then evaluation category, that's judgment and reasoning. And then metacognition category is where reflection and intuition come in. And final category of creativity and agency, it's really, that's where eponymous creativity and will, agency, will, pretty much there's no other way to describe it. That's the category, and the movements of thought are named the same because these are the most, you could say, higher or level, most abstract, most ineffable functions of our mind and our thinking that can happen, and the least easily explained or studied or analyzed, really, right? So you can turn the analysis on thought itself, and you can understand how we perceive, how we use attention, memory, and imagination. It's easier to understand and analyze and grasp than understanding how creativity works, how will works, even reasoning and judgment, and these matters are easier understood than creativity and will. But often judgment is a problem in itself. To understand how you judge and why judgment works in a certain manner, and it's not all relative. Judgment has certain rationality to it, and you can justify making a judgment. It's not completely arbitrary. It may be sometimes, and that's why it's sometimes so hard to understand where the artistic judgment, who's right and who's wrong, whose opinion is right and whose opinion is completely unjustified and hot air, because everybody presents their opinion as somehow reasoned and justified, but it's not always the case, and that's why understanding all of these is important. Okay, well, thank you for your attention as always. Pretty simple typology, but it took a while to explain everything, which goes to show how complex our minds are and how fascinating it all is. Next time, my poll is still open. Not very, I haven't gotten too much feedback, just a few people responded. And I have my own ideas how to proceed, and I will most likely proceed that way. But if you still have time to respond, if you have your provide your input, and I will remind you of a link. But next time I will probably start looking at some of the Ukrainian contexts and history and culture, and probably one of the foundational figures of Ukrainian philosophy as well. Okay, see you next time. Bye-bye.